everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of the Music My Lab. Today I'm joined by Angela Wan, who is a pianist and also a singer, and she's also a recent college graduate, so it's very exciting for us to have someone like this on the podcast for the first time. So to start off, Angela, since you've been through so many different musical communities and musical groups, could you start off by telling us how you got involved in all of these different musical experiences in the first place? So how you started playing piano and how you started getting involved in singing and different singing groups.
Okay, so I think I actually started singing slightly before I started playing piano. This was when I was around 5 years old, I would say. And then I started taking piano lessons. I actually started off taking group lessons, and then eventually I got switched to a private instructor. And then around that time is when I started taking private singing lessons, and I also started doing community theater productions. And I think that just naturally lent itself to being in choir. And so I auditioned for Columbia choirs when I was around 6 or 7. And I sang in that from the time I was in elementary school through basically all of middle school. I only took 1 year off. I took 7th grade off. And then when I got to high school, I was still playing piano and I was still singing in choir. And that continued through the end of high school, going into college. So that's a little bit of my musical background.
That's really cool. And I was wondering, since you mentioned that you were part of musical theater, and obviously with classical music, learning piano classically and having that training compared to musical theater, which is a completely different kind of music making, I was wondering, could you talk about what the main differences or similarities between those two experiences were, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, for sure. Singing more broadly, it's a very embodied experience. Because you are the instrument, your voice is the instrument, there's a lot of focus on the physicality of that and how to translate proper breathing techniques or like proper posture into how your singing actually sounds. Whereas I would say that playing an instrument in general is more about building a relationship with that instrument. So instead of the focus being on projection towards an audience, you're actually focusing more on sort of understanding and bringing out the best qualities of your instrument. I would say that's the primary difference. Also, playing an instrument is much more up to individual interpretation, depending on the repertoire that you're working on, the pieces you're working on. While being in choir or just being in a group context in terms of music making is how you can contribute to a unified sound as opposed to putting your own spin on things.
Definitely. That's really interesting, especially I relate a lot to what you said about making more unified sound. I think I got that a lot from my orchestral experience with violin, and it was definitely a big shift from being a solo musician for so long and only being focused on my own sound, and like you said, focusing on developing my relationship with my own instrument rather than with others. And kind of building off of this topic of your different artistic experiences, I want to highlight your visual arts experience since you are an amazing visual artist. And I was just wondering, do you think that has interacted or helped your performing arts experiences at all? And if so, could you explain how exactly it has helped you or affected you?
Yeah, definitely. I think visual art in particular, there's this very strong guiding philosophy of specificity, where you have to be very specific about how you communicate certain messages using visual elements. So how do I choose visual elements that will reflect my message most accurately, especially because visual art or visual creation is one of the mediums where it's pretty universally understood. So you have to really think about, will this be understood cross-culturally across people who are of different ages, different cultures, things like that. And I think that also guides my approach to music a lot, where I'm thinking about how to develop very targeted spots in terms of my performance and my musical expression. So rather than like, we're gonna work on this section to make it, sound more dramatic, it's like, what specifically can produce that effect? What sorts of phrasings, what sorts of hand positions, or like different lyricism in terms of how you break down a passage. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just how do you make your performance very specific and produce like very distinct sounds.
Definitely. That's really cool to think about. One thing I am pretty curious to ask you about is your relationship with classical music, because for a lot of young people, myself included, classical music is kind of an acquired taste where it takes time to be able to kind of understand the expression or start to form an intention about what you actually want to express. And I was wondering, since you did start in theater and in choir, and I think also in visual art, where you mentioned these are art forms that are more easily understood. You know, in musical theater, there's a clear story, there's a clear character every single moment in the production. And so I was wondering, do you think those have helped you overcome that hurdle of not fully understanding or connecting to classical music as an early musician?
That's a really interesting question. I think for me, it was less about the music itself and more so the alienation that I felt from the community. I think that a lot of the times, and maybe this has changed a lot because I'm currently not a part of the classical music scene, so I don't really know what the younger generations are like in terms of their attitudes towards classical music and what the community looks like generally. Classical music for me was always, especially when I was just taking lessons and learning it in my earlier childhood and through middle school and high school and such, it was much more an obligatory thing. So it was more so something that I was just fitting into my schedule because I felt like, this was something that I had to do, and less because I felt a personal investment in the music that I was creating. But I think after I came to college, I was a lot more intentional with how I engage with music and how I found my music community. And that's when I sort of realized that classical music, it's not just a genre, but it's also a form of discipline, right? A lot of people who are trained classically, it's about like developing very specific, very targeted practicing techniques. It requires a lot of personal discipline. You have to extend that over your very long practice sessions. And I think there's just a broader appreciation for personal work ethic, but also an ability to really derive your personal artistry from the music. Because the thing with non-classical music is that like a lot of the times the message is already laid out for you. If you look at popular genres, most of the interpretation is done by the artists themselves. But I think for classical music, the community is just very involved in creating a personal, relationship with the music. And that was something that finally made it kind of like click for me a little bit. It was less about like the music itself, but like how do you actually create a personal relationship with music and how do you let that translate into your other parts of creative processing?
Now that you've brought up your college experiences, I feel like this is a great time to shift gears more towards that topic. And I think it's definitely a topic that a lot of younger musicians and just students in general are wondering about. So I was hoping you could talk a bit about leading up to the college application process, actually, when you're in high school, how you balanced music with other parts of your life. Because I know you did so many things other than music, right? You did art, volunteering, you had academics, you had clubs, etc. So there was a lot to manage. So how did you manage that mentally? And how did you still make time for music while also taking on so many commitments?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this briefly earlier, but music when I was in high school was not so much a personal undertaking, but more so an obligation that I was, just having to fit into my schedule. But in terms of actually like balancing my time, there's sort of a lot of commotion around like having a very strict routine and like sticking yourself into a program that you create for yourself. And there's all sorts of schools of thought around like, oh, productivity or efficiency. If you're not like devoting every single second of your time to doing something productive, then you've like somehow failed. And I think that's the most direct route to burnout and a lot of other mental problems. So I think the part that I want to emphasize here, as someone who has come through that process and thankfully survived, is it's less about finding the most like aggressive means of beating your body and mind into like submission inside of a system, but like figuring out ways to like sort of relax from that as well. So like for me, that was also music. I was doing classical music as a part of my like practicing, and I was doing like performance and festivals too, but also using music as a way to relax and sort of unwind. So it's like finding things that might otherwise be stressors in your life and trying to exercise them in a way that will allow you to be more relaxed about it, I guess is the best way I can put it.
That's very cool to hear, and I resonate a lot with what you were saying about the mindset of productivity and efficiency. That's a very overwhelming narrative for a lot of kids these days. And now we can shift forward in the timeline to your time in college. So we've been keeping it kind of mysterious so far, but could you introduce where you went to college and how your musical experience there was? How did you continue participating in musical communities and continue making music during your time in college?
So, I recently graduated from NYU. I majored in language and mind, which is not really related to music in particular, but I think the language element does translate a little bit. But in terms of music, I was involved in an organization called Musical Mentors Collaborative. They're a national organization and they had chapters in the New York area. And so I was involved with that starting my freshman spring, I believe. Basically, what that entailed was I would go to public elementary schools in the area and I gave individual and group level music instruction to the kids there. And that was the primary way that I was keeping music in my life throughout college, since I was really bogged down by a lot of my pre-med obligations and, just doing the grind, trying to find internships and other volunteer opportunities and such. And so that was a really good way for me to stay connected with music. And in particular, that experience helped refresh a lot of my own appreciation for music and for musical education, because I think a lot of the times for advanced musicians, as you're probably very well aware of, you develop a sort of intuition for the music that you produce. You just have an innate sense of this is what sounds right, this is the sound that I want to produce. But kids don't have that. People who don't have prior musical instruction, they don't have that intuition at all. That's something that's you hone and you develop through like years and years of dedicated practice. And so being able to coach kids through that, teaching them the first motor substrate of how to develop their sense of musicality, it's like, oh, you shape your hand like this, we move the phrase like this. It was really helpful for me to understand how my own musicality developed, because I think when you're in the midst of it as a musician, when you're just practicing all the time, you're not really thinking about what you're doing sometimes. It's just something that comes reflexively, or because you're so used to it, it's just a product of habit. But when you really break down and look at the individual pieces, it's just so complex, and the way that it all comes together and produces this very high level cognitive intuition is just really impressive. So yeah, that was the main thing that I was doing with music through college. I also did take a chamber class. So at that point I hadn't been doing private instruction for a while, but I think having that focused instruction again brought me back to oh, this is the importance of musical education. This is why it's so important to have these resources, and especially to make these resources accessible, because it's not just the fact that you have a new skill now and you can play this instrument, maybe you can read sheet music, but it's also because you've essentially unlocked a new part of your identity. Being able to find an expressive outlet through music is very liberating and can be transformative for a lot of people.
Well, I really like how you articulated that, especially at the end when you're talking about finding musical expression as kind of this very liberating experience. And I think that's something I've come to realize recently. And obviously, I haven't gone through the college experience yet, so I probably still have a lot more mental breakthroughs and liberations to go through. But I think, especially growing up with classical music, the whole idea of you're playing this piece that was written by someone else, right? I felt kind of trapped in this constraints of a piece of what I actually had to play, of all the requirements of playing in tune, playing like this, sounding like this, and it never felt very creative or personal for myself. And I think over time, just like you mentioned, honing my own personal voice and finding out what musical expression can actually do in times of stress or mental fatigue for myself, those two were definitely huge factors in helping me appreciate music more. And I think what you mentioned about your major is really interesting, and a lot of the stuff you said about the cognitive processes of learning music. And since this platform is about connecting music and neuroscience, I am really interested in hearing, did you learn any insights from your neuroscience education that connected to music or helped your musical expression or experience at all?
Yeah, so one of the biggest takeaways that I had from studying linguistics from the perspective of neuroscience, I remember taking my interlinguistics class, and the professor mentioned there's this very popular concept in the field of linguistics that's referred to as universal grammar. And it's the idea that every child or every human being is predisposed with the ability to acquire language, and not just their language of the culture or the country that they're born in, but any language. So they have the neural tools and substrates to learn the phonemes, the different sounds of every single language on this earth. but that has a very narrow ideal window, and then the decay is also pretty fast. So once you get past a certain age, the general consensus is like somewhere between the ages of 5 and 8, you sort of lose the ability to acquire other languages in a native-like fashion. And I think that understanding of like the neural timeline of how we as humans are able to pick up and acquire language made me think about how children are getting like early music education, because even though we have like very strict academic definitions for what a language actually is, but for me personally, and I think for a lot of other musicians, music is its own type of language. It's an extension of ourselves, our emotional states, how we want to like communicate with other people, or like if we're in a group setting, how we want to communicate with our group members, come together, create this uniform sound. And so if we have the natural neural decay of language acquisition set from somewhere in early childhood, then it's even more crucial to have these resources early and have these resources in places where children and young people can access them and in their own way unlock that language of music going forward in their lives.
Wow, that is super duper interesting. I've heard a lot of things about early musical training, and a lot of them have been negative actually, about how early musical training can lead to burnout and can lead to lost passion for learning an instrument or just pursuing music in general, which I think definitely holds true with others' experiences. But hearing how you framed it was really interesting and makes me think about how we might be able to balance that early music education while also allowing children to explore and have a positive relationship with music early on. Okay, I think burning question that a lot of people, a lot of high schoolers are probably hoping that you can answer for us is during the college application process, since I know that you didn't apply to a music-centered major, correct? And even though you had these very, very strong musical and artistic experiences in high school, I guess I'm wondering, how did you balance that in your application? Do you have any words of advice for students who are also very musically or artistically inclined in high school, but they feel like they want to apply to a more academic focused subject in college?
Yeah, I think when it comes to that problem, what aspect of music or whatever creative activity you're involved in do you actually prioritize the most? What is actually the most important for you? Because for a lot of the people who apply to art programs or music programs, they go forward into college and into their career expectedly with these creative pursuits. The driving factor is that they want to do this professionally. They have some sort of idea of how they would incorporate that into their profession and into like a professional trajectory. But for me, at least, and I think for a lot of creative people who were sort of on the edge about that, debating between whether or not applying to like a creative major would be a worthy investment, is that the thing that I appreciated the most about music and also art was the personal aspect of it, the personal expression and the freedom that I felt from being able to create my own work and find a medium for my ideas more specifically. And I think just from what I've heard from people who have gone to art school, reading reviews from art school, the way that you're trained in these environments, and I assume it's something similar in music school, but I'm not super familiar with that, is the idea that like your skills are being honed and you are being trained to become a part of an industry. So the way that your skills are going to be calibrated is to be most advantageous to a job or a position. So it's less about finding that personal element and more about how do we make you the most prepared that we can for a job in this professional field. TLDR, like the biggest thing you need to figure out is like what element of music or art or whatever creative thing you're doing do you think is the driving factor, and does it lend itself to a sort of industry-oriented approach to training, or do you appreciate having your own freedom and being able to create your own sort of artistic vision?
Thank you so much for that. I think it definitely answered my question. I'm sure a lot of other high schoolers listening to this appreciated that a lot as well. So I was wondering, before we wrap things up, could you maybe give us a final message or word of advice that you want to share to the listeners?
Okay, I think my final message is like, create for yourself. I think that's the biggest thing I want to say. I think, especially for music, and classical music, no less. It's such a competitive environment, and I've seen you obviously practicing for all your competitions, all your festivals, all your, all the crazy things you're doing with music right now. And there's this idea that in order to maintain relevance or gain visibility in these fields, in these environments, you need to be the best. You need to be so technically proficient. You need to be practically perfect in all elements, in all aspects of all your performances, whatever. There's this huge gleaming glass bubble that everybody's aiming for. But I think at the end of the day, like, what is art really? What is music really? To me personally, it's a way to explore your humanity and connect with like the most important, like intimate emotional parts of yourself. And so at the end of the day, just make sure you have that core guiding light for whatever it is you're doing. Yes, accomplishment is important. Especially if you want to do more with music, if you want to like go to school, for example, or if you want to become a professional musician. Obviously, it's very important to have these things, but I think you should still follow that internal compass that reaffirms your belief in music and why you like choose this over other art, over other activities, over everything else to begin with. Create for yourself. Like, you are the most important element in all the art that you make.
Wow, my goodness. Thank you so much, Angela, for sharing all of your wisdom and really valuable words of advice. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else listening to this is super grateful for you as well. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Please look forward to the next episode, which will be released next week.